for their significance. In fact, this is what I love. It is common that environmental data are not subjected to normal statistical tests, as in their precision, variation, standard deviation, significance, or probability of difference. He basically says it's common for these people not to look at the data. You know, they don't. I mean, when we go through here, you'll see that the scientific practices of this group is just awful, and we're just now starting to get into it. In environmental considerations, the final conclusion and the projection of future developments are often derived from model calculations for which they only inaccurately know base data. Basically, garbage in, garbage out. Just like I showed you, they just Mauna Loa, Arctic ice cores. Let's mix them together. Okay. I mean, the logic behind what they do doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Also, in scientific discussions, the other thing that you'll see when you do a lot of research for what goes on in the global warming community, you'll see that if you speak out against them, you get demonized, you get trashed, and they attack your credibility. And he mentions the same thing here. He says, also in scientific discussions, sometimes the sentiment of the generally accepted view of the scientific community is heard. Basically, they always come up. There's a consensus, which we'll get to in a little bit. Okay? As if verification or falsification of scientific hypothesis is a matter of majority vote. Is the world flat? Yep. Earth's flat. That's not how it's done. The data decides what's true, not whether or not everyone agrees with you. Okay? Derogatory statements about a person's scientific reputation. Okay? He also mentions that. Are least helpful, is what he says. So basically he's making acknowledgement that he knows that if he says this, he's going to be attacked, but he's at least going to say it. And you'll see that quite often whenever you see these things, people are kind of like scared to death to mention anything. Here's another thing that he wrote. Attempts to support global warming thesis with analysis of the carbon dioxide contents of air bubbles and glacial ice samples are based on fudged data and ignorance of the physical processes of glacial ice formation. Alan Gore must not have read that one. All right? But he fell right into it. I guarantee you Al didn't figure out the Mauna Loa thing. From its very beginning, the hypothesis of anthropogenic, that's man-made greenhouse gas warming, was tainted with a biased selection data. And we're going to get to the biased data selection here coming up. Ad hoc assumptions and were not verified experimentally. Okay? The one-sided interpretations, and you'll see a lot of this one-sided interpretation, such as symptoms of affliction, which Irving so-and-so called the pathological science. So he's basically saying that they call the global warming people pathological science. They typically are trying to prove something instead of just trying to look into it and find out what's really going on. And we'll leave that here in a minute.
Joe Borowski, is that exactly?
Yeah. Okay. Here's the actual data that he's complaining about. Right? This is the data on which we created that other chart, on which they used to create the other chart. You know anything wrong with this?
There's a gap.
There's a gap. Right? And once again, these people don't seem to understand how to read charts. All right? Part of my background is economics, so I love these charts. And but you'll see here, the ice core data, because it has to come from down deep, it stops about 100 years ago. Right? Then they pick up with Mauna Loa, and they combine the two. Right? But you notice, for one, there's a huge gap in time, and two, CO2, 100 years ago, is a lot higher than it was in 1950. Right? So CO2, according to their own data, fell from 1890 to 1950.
Animal industrial age drop.
Yeah. And so if you look at it, the 1950 level was actually equal to the 1860 level. So over a full 90-year period, CO2 was flat. Okay? That's their data. However, how'd they get the one chart? This is what I love. Okay? In normal science, what would you do? You would probably never use these two data samples together. Okay? But how do you get that one chart that they showed? You simply shift the data 83 years. That's what they did. They said, okay, well, we got these two. They said, shift it over. Okay. That's what you mean by fudge data. Now that's, once again, this is not my chart.
They didn't even do a normal extrapolation.
No. They just simply said, well,
I can understand the ice core thing because it's almost like tree rings. Because you can't go back 1 year with a tree ring. You got to go back. There's a discrete.
Sure, but why not fill that big void with a splash data? when I go and get flash
In
data,
the same place.
now, does the flash data exist during that time period?
No.
It does.
Oh, it does?
So they deliberately didn't use it. Matter of fact, they used some of the data. Okay, and here it is. Man-made CO2 is caused. This is the flash data.
What kind of data is clear?
This is the.
Already go out and get her.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Flash.
There's
Flash.
flash. There's two types of sources. There's core sample, like I showed the guy drilling, and the other one they take a core sample, just a flash.
Air grab sample.
Air grab sample. They've got it. And not only do they have it, there's no real need for that core samples because they've got it all the way back to 1810. Now why wouldn't you just use the flash data? Can anyone explain?
Yeah, it doesn't match up.
It doesn't make right. Why? Because if you look back in 1810, atmospheric CO2 is 550. Okay? Today it's 370. Once again, flash data shows CO2 decreasing. All right? And what this is, here, let me see here.
Well, these guys are sweethearts, aren't they?
Okay, back then there's a maximum of 550, and that's right up here. The average is 335. Now you remember to what? Oh, really? Oh, thanks, Peter. The average is 335. The current level is 370. So in reality, if you use just the same type of data sample, we're barely above the average over the last 200 or so years. And more importantly, CO2 is nowhere near a high. This is nowhere near that. So if they think that is a high, we're nowhere near an atmospheric high if you use the same data approach. Okay? And once again, this isn't my data. Okay? Bingo. And right there you have it. Okay? Al Gore somehow thinks this level is higher than that level. Okay? In order to create an average to make it look like the CO2 was lower back then, these circle data is what they used as the average.
He learned that in divinity school.
Why did they choose
Well,
that?
I don't know.
That justifies his lower SAT scores than yours.
What makes that data, why do you choose that?
Well,
Is there anything more?
what the
significant
circle
about it?
data here is, what they did was they wanted to have an average so that they could show that the CO2 was increasing. So they cherry-picked this data, which out of this data set resulted in a lower average of CO2, so they could show a higher climb.
So in the original data set, there's nothing to set those apart from other samples?
I'm not following.
Like the ones they circled, they're,
Well, the ones that they sort, what they did here was they used they wanted to use an average of the thing. By choosing this data set, which
I
is
mean,
what they
they
said.
choosing was just entirely random.
Total random. Okay? Of course, why would you do that? I don't know why you would do it, but when you go back and you take an average of all the data set, it's a higher average. Okay? Once again, I hope that you're not believing any of this because the links will take you sorry. This is another one, and to show you how incestuous this data is, this is from another source. In the fine print, once again, it's the Mauna Loa data combined with ice cores. Go find any chart out there, you'll see what they do is they use this bad data on everywhere. Okay? Once again, you have thousands of years time, you have temperature, and you have CO2. All right? Okay. Now take a look at this. This is another flaw. The whole theory is increase in CO2 leads to increase in temperature, right? Cause and effect. CO2 goes up, temperature goes up. Here's a horizontal line showing you the peaks of temperature in the previous cycles. Now these cycles last about 100,000 years. You typically have 100,000 years of ice age, 10,000 years of warming, 100,000 years of ice age. We're overdue for the next ice age, by the way. Okay? But if you notice here, here's the peak of temperature. This is their own chart. Here is the temperature recently. It's well off the peak 10,000 years ago. So temperatures have been falling, and yet their own chart shows CO2 going through the roof. Once again, never before in history, these are all the peaks of CO2 prior, have you been anywhere close to 370. This is a full 30% higher than ever before in history. Now you would assume that if CO2 is at record highs, the temperature would at least be close to a record.